All right. Thank you all for being here. Stewart, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
So we are here to talk about artificial intelligence and the future of work, especially as that relates to Slack, but in general. So to start, I am interested in why Slack is thinking about these technologies, but I'd also like to hear you maybe set the stage a little bit about what we actually mean. AI, quote unquote, has come to mean everything from the dream of general artificial intelligence down to what we used to just kind of call analytics. So why are you thinking about these technologies at Slack, and what do you actually mean when you use these terms?
Okay, so we probably shouldn't spend a whole lot of time on this part, but for philosophical reasons, I'm not a believer in general artificial intelligence. And the blanket term probably, I think when most people use it, means more like complex software that works, but we don't know why exactly it works. So I think it applies to machine learning and a lot of approaches that are AI-based. Slack's mission is to make people's working lives simpler, more pleasant, and more productive. So the reason we're interested in it is pretty simple and straightforward. We think there's an opportunity to make people's working lives simpler, more pleasant, and more productive. And that can be things like automated summarizations, highlighting messages, which we think are going to be especially important, improved search, all the way up to our dreams for the future, some virtual chief of staff that reads every single message for you and can proactively recommend a small number of things, not just that you should pay attention to, but that you should take care of today.
And where are you in that journey from the features that actually are already underlying the application to this being the very beginning of a set of features that we'll see over a period of years?
Let's say that's here, and I would say that we're here. So you probably can't tell, but my hand's about 1 centimeter off the stage.
Gotcha. So 1 centimeter into it. I guess I'm curious, I think of Slack as a very human piece of software. I use it in my day-to-day. It's where I go for human expertise. So as you think about this vision, how do you think about, maintaining that and what artificial intelligence, quote unquote, sort of does to further human expertise and collaboration?
I think that part's pretty easy. So I don't see squeezing the people out. And here's some examples of the kind of stuff that we're doing today. There are generally two types of searches that people do in Slack. One is for something, some item, message, document, or something like that that people either know exists, sometimes because they created it themselves, or they suspect that it exists, like documentation for how to sign up for a 401k or something like that. And then there's another type of search that people do where they just want information about a topic. And if you think about the large number of jargon, special terms inside of most companies, an example from inside of Slack is if you start on the Slack engineering team, you'll hear about something called flannel over and over again. And that's just a regular word in the English language. For us, it's a special server-side caching technology for fast startup of Slack teams. So you type the word flannel into search, and it will recommend people and channels where that topic is frequently discussed, and the people who appear to be experts, which is something that's really challenging as the organization gets larger. So a lot of those, certainly none of those take away any of the humanity from the software, and ideally it takes away some of the drudge work, some of the kind of repetitive actions that don't require any human intelligence or creativity, so that there's actually more time to exercise those things that are truly human.
Yeah, and I would imagine that there's potential for machine learning to actually identify expertise in the organization that kind of democratizes that. So it's not just, who do the leaders of the company think, have these pieces of knowledge, but actually the software might be able to sort of identify those pockets in a way that's actually more efficient.
Yeah, that's actually, we have a huge amount of signal, including, so imagine, well, I should have done this in the beginning. How many of you use Slack? Hands up.
A couple.
Most people, 75, 80% maybe. If you have 10 channels that have unread messages, there's probably one that you're most likely to click on, and over time we can build a model of which channels are most important to you based on once it becomes unread, how soon do you click on it. Same thing with people. If you have 10 DMs from different people, which one do you tend to click on most often? With whom do you share the most channel overlaps? Whose messages are you most likely to react to? And through all that signal, we can do a pretty good job in figuring out which messages are likely to be important to you. And I would say at this point, it's, I don't know, 90% accurate. It probably only needs to be 50 or 60% accurate to be good enough for that application. The future of that, I think, is what I mentioned in the beginning, trying to figure out which things you need to take care of, and that's much harder than either summarization or identification of things that are especially important.
Yeah, I mean, it's a version in some ways, I would imagine, of what Google faces as it moves from search to automated assistant. You know, the accuracy that is required to make that assistant model work is substantially higher than what's required to make search results pretty decent. So I can imagine, and I think you even mentioned sort of the assistant-ification of Slack in some way, where there's an aspect of the software that is actively sort of acting as like, here's how to get up to speed on this or that, or here's what you need to do next. I mean, is that the vision? Talk to me a little bit about sort of when you look at the future of work more broadly, Slack at the center of it, hopefully, but bigger than that. How do you think these technologies, machine learning, and all this data will actually change how we actually go about our days?
It's hard to be too, to predict with any degree of accuracy exactly how people spend their time.
We're going to hold you to all of these, for sure.
If there's one broad stroke, I think it's people spending less time, again, on those things that don't really require human intelligence or creativity. So I'm just old enough that I was part of the generation where it wasn't just okay to bring a calculator to math class, but you actually were required to go out and buy a calculator and bring it to math class. And you spend the first couple of years in school learning how to do addition and subtraction, basic arithmetic. But then you start to learn things that require a level of abstraction that goes beyond that arithmetic. And we've seen that kind of similar dynamic play out in things like spreadsheets, probably the single most important application for individual users in all of computing history. People are now able to do stuff that just wasn't really possible, kind of sensitivity analysis and scenario planning that in 1978, the year before spreadsheets came out, was just, you couldn't do it. So what's the next step after that? And we look at knowledge working organizations, and this is not something that we've done any research on or have quantitative backing for, but pretty strong believers that about 30% of the communication that goes on inside of organizations are answers to simple, basic, factual questions, like who is so-and-so's manager, who worked on this project, who's a contact at this company, when did this office location open. And a friend of mine who works at JP Morgan showed me the 800 or 900 emails he gets a day that are prefixed with ISO, I seek out, and it can be anything from a contact at Credit Suisse in Brazil that does fixed income to, again, who is so-and-so's manager, who worked on this report, who has a good contact at this customer company. And when you think about that, one person at a 280,000 person company getting 8 or 900 emails a day, it's like a room this size. It's kind of my visualization of it, and people just shouting out like, hey, can anyone help me get something? And taking away that, I think, takes away the equivalent of doing that basic arithmetic in the math class or recalculating over and over the same ledgers for that little bit of sensitivity analysis. What we do with that extra time is harder to predict.
The AI researcher Andrew Ng has a good line about this that he suggests as a basic heuristic: if a human can do it in a second or less, think seriously about the possibility that we'll use AI. And that seems sort of broadly in line of these technologies helping us take care of the bits of our job that maybe we're sort of just sucking up time, weren't the most creative or fulfilling parts anyway. Surely there are people who are a little more worried about how these technologies might take away jobs, or at least large parts of jobs from people. I mean, how do you think about the risks? Are you relatively upbeat about this collaborative future?
I'm very optimistic. It flies in the face of like the whole of human history to think that we're going to come up with some final technology that replaces humans, because no one, well, who knows? Maybe there were people who were like, fuck, Archimedes, quit it with the lever and the pulley and stuff like that. You're going to put a whole bunch of people out of work. It's just never happened. You go back 150 years, 70, 80% of the population here and in the US, everywhere in Europe, most of Asia would have been agrarian. So people would have been farmers. And now in the US, it's 1.5% or 2% of people are farmers. Those people found other things to do. And each unfolding of technology is going to bring with it some bad things and some good things, but certainly new opportunities. And I can't see why AI would be any different.
So another worry that I think is starting to become more common is that there are a small number of companies that right now seem to have a substantial lead in these technologies. Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon. And I've heard academics, startups, politicians essentially express some version of what if AI ends up being sort of controlled, or at least all of the sort of most talented people in that space end up working for these handful of companies. I'm curious how you think about that, given that you are running a tech company that sees this as a central part of its future.
I think that broadly, and this won't be true in a uniform way across geography or across time, but broadly, the benefits that accrue from that kind of basic research and advances in the technology will benefit everyone over time. And there definitely can be a period where one company has a distinct advantage, just as Ford Motor Company in 1920 had a distinct advantage, or Dow Chemical in 1930 had a distinct advantage. We think about it from our own perspective, maybe through the lens of competition. I'm not sure if competition is the right word, but we have a couple dozen people working on AI projects versus, I think, something about 12,000 at Microsoft, thousands at Facebook, at Google, at Baidu, at all these different companies. There's no way that the bulk of the innovation is going to come from us. But on the other hand, most of the advantages that companies end up with are based on their access to data, as opposed to some special proprietary algorithm.
So you bring up access to data, and I guess Slack is at a really interesting position. I guess we talked a little bit about people and how my job or your job might change a little bit, your day-to-day. But maybe you could tell us a little bit about your vision of this in terms of organizations. So Slack is in this interesting sense, this repository of a lot of sort of what makes the organization, at least in the context of knowledge work. Mm-hmm. So as these technologies are layered on and you're able to sort of summarize the most important developments or highlight the key experts, does that have any ramifications for sort of what an organization or a company looks like? Yeah,
so turns out, at least for me anyway, the hard part of running a company is all the people and the organizational dynamics, the efforts you put in to avoid politics becoming really dominant, to improve performance, to figure out the best organizational design. And there are very few tools you can get to get real feedback on that. So there's a lot of employee engagement tools, which are great, and that's a relatively new thing. And we're seeing a lot of innovation on the Slack platform in that specific area, so to get real-time feedback from people. But here's a couple of examples of things that don't exist yet, but which would be pretty useful. So one would be sentiment analysis differentials between different parts of the company. So sentiment analysis tends to be pretty basic. You look at the language, and you look for the occurrence of positive words and negative words, and you say whether it says positive or negative sentiment. Turns out this is one of the first things we did for our own usage of Slack, to look at our sentiment, and turns out it was, if you aggregate it, it was about 50% all the time. It kind of went up and down. So basically no useful signal. But when there are differentials in sentiment, then you can find friction or problems inside the organization. And if you can go one step further to find differentials in sentiment around a particular search term or around a particular facet or a conversational topic, I think there's something really interesting there. We have a group, part of search learning intelligence, called Organizational Insights, really, really early for us. But the goal is, to 5 years from now, be in a position that, looking back at this time for CEOs, it will be like imagining that you're flying a plane without any instruments. So start to give people real instruments for how the organization is doing. And I really want to stress that I don't mean like time card, punch clock, are people being productive? Because I think that's actually really, really difficult to mention or to measure. But more, where are there breakdowns? Where are there a lack of alignment? And one of the very first projects we did on this was to look at Slack, the company, from the perspective of an individual team. So if you look at Slack, the company, from the perspective of the facilities team, then legal looms really large, finance is a major part of the interface to the rest of the company, security, marketing, engineering, those parts of the company that are really big, customer support, actually are really small from their perspective. But if you flip it and look at the company from the perspective of marketing, it's entirely different. And those interfaces between the different groups, I think, are a really interesting signal for how you're doing overall.
Yeah. We published a couple of pieces at HBR sort of imagining what this could look like in terms of how organizations change. And so if you reorganize or restructure, would you be able to use data in some way to just, again, not to be dictating how someone's spending their day, but to figure out, like, wow, there's a real problem here. This group is clearly, either doesn't like the change or hasn't figured out how to work with this other group. And I think the analogy you gave about the airplane instruments is going to turn out to be quite true there.
Yeah.
So my last question, I'm curious how you think about these technologies in terms of time spent. So one thing that you've been saying is that these technologies will allow us to better prioritize communication. So there's this stream of communication in an organization, and instead of those reply all email requests of who can help me out on this thing, there will be Slack or something else will be elevating the things you should be paying attention to. On the other hand, lots of people, depending on the business model, who make software applications, like the idea that people are going to be spending time in them. Facebook is essentially just how much time can we keep you in Facebook. Slack, obviously, a very different business model. Does this decrease the amount of time that we end up spending in these communication tools? Like, have we sort of crossed over beyond peak communication and this peels us back?
Yeah, I think so. We definitely don't have any motivation to try to keep people in Slack. People spend a really long time already. So on average, across all of our daily active users, people spend a little over 2 hours in what we call active usage. So reading a message, writing a message, opening the app, changing channel, uploading a file, anything that we can actually detect or measure. We get nothing if that goes from 2 hours and 12 minutes to 2 hours and 17 minutes. In fact, it might be better if it went from 2 hours and 12 minutes to an hour and 51 minutes or something like that. But I think ultimately people are going to spend the same amount of time. And I like this analogy quite a bit. There are people here in Lisbon who work for the city that are responsible for digging ditches. And there were 100 years ago. 100 years ago, they would primarily use shovels. Now they primarily use backhoes. They still spend the same number of hours at work each day, and they still complain about work to the same extent when they get home. But you get a lot more ditches dug when you use a backhoe than when you use a shovel. It's a difficult thing to do a true comparison on, but by our best estimates, if you look at an organization of about 10,000 people using email as the primary means of communication versus using Slack, in this case, the person who has the most access to information might have 0.03% access, and in this case, maybe 15%. So that's 500 times more access to information. If you're spending the same amount of time on it, then that access means generally that you're getting either more done, or you just have much more context, and you're better equipped to get your job done. But as that amount of information increases, I think the tools that help automate the management of it are going to be increasingly valuable.
Stewart, Butterfield, thank you for being here.
Thank you.